Hello, and welcome to Sustainable Outlook, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the transactions, technologies, and trends in the sustainable economy. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out with suggested topics or guests, or questions about how we can work together to create a sustainable economy.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. I'm Elizabeth Crouse, a partner in the K&L Gates tax group and co-lead of our Global Power Group, which encompasses all things energy transition. I'm joined today by Alana Duerr, who is Director of U.S. Projects for Simply Blue Group. In that role, Alana is responsible for the development and implementation of market-specific strategies to deploy innovative and cost-effective floating offshore wind projects in the United States. Alana has been part of the offshore wind industry in the United States since 2013. And has done a lot of things during her career, including serving as the offshore wind lead for the U.S. Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technologies Office, and was involved with R&D, technology demonstration, important work with NYSERDA, and was a leader in the development and implementation of the 2016 National Offshore Wind Strategy. Before joining Simply Blue, she was most recently the director for the North American Offshore Wind Team at D&D, and she has a PhD in ocean engineering and a BS in naval architecture and marine engineering. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alana.
Thanks for having me, Elizabeth. I'm happy to be here.
Why don't we kick off with just sort of a simple question? Where does Simply Blue Group fit into the offshore wind industry?
Good place to start. So the Simply Blue Group is a blue economy developer based out of Cork, Ireland. And that's our home market in the British Isles. We are developing floating offshore wind projects in particular for the offshore winds in the offshore wind space, but we're also looking at sustainable aquaculture and power to X types of things. But everything is related to the ocean. And we look for projects that help the energy transition and utilizing the ocean to help us get there faster. So offshore wind is our biggest market opportunity that we see. We have over 4.5 gigawatts of projects under development in the British Isles with various commercial partners. And there have been a lot of announcements from a global perspective that we've made in terms of our global pipeline. And last year, we made the decision to really put a marker in the U.S. and expand the team in the U.S. So I joined Simply Blue last July to help establish our U.S. presence and start to focus on the U.S. market in a really meaningful way. Since joining Simply Blue, we've actually formed a joint venture with Total Energies in the U.S. to develop floating offshore wind projects. And Total Energies is Total, but they have rebranded to Total Energies. So just for anyone who is typically used to hearing Total and Total Energies are the same. I had that challenge at first. But we've partnered to develop floating offshore wind projects in the US, and we see huge opportunity on all coasts for floating offshore wind to be a key contributor to realizing the energy transition. And we're particularly excited that BOEM actually has floating lease areas on their leasing roadmap to start auctioning off that area soon. We are a relatively new joint venture, but even from our first meetings, we've been talking about the great potential for floating offshore wind off of Oregon. And we actually made that our first target market last year. And over the last few months, we've been doing some on the ground work. We've hired some new people, and we're really excited to announce that we're taking on a distinct identity in Oregon called Deep Blue Pacific Wind. Our joint venture isn't just about one project or one market. It's about floating offshore wind in the U.S. So we wanted something that was a little more connected to the space in which we're working. Mm-hmm. We wanted something that was distinct from our parent companies. I mean, we see this on the East Coast all the time, where there's a joint venture and then they come up with a project identity. But we wanted to establish something right now, as opposed to after the auction, so that we can start to really get into the community and build the relationships now and not after the auction. We know that establishing relationships and trust with stakeholders, especially in the coastal community, is imperative. And the last thing you want to do is muddle that message after a lease sale and have to start explaining it then. So we were establishing Deep Blue Pacific Wind as our brand now, so that we can have that connective thread. Our team has deep roots in the state of Oregon and the Pacific Northwest more broadly. And we think it's important that our project brand represents our presence in the Pacific. And we're really making a push to establish ourselves in Oregon. We have an office that just opened in Portland, and we expect the team there to expand in the coming months. So it's really exciting and a great time to start publishing that we've got our new brand.
That's fantastic and super exciting that you all are targeting Oregon. You mentioned that it's really important to establish relationships with communities. I think that's particularly true on the West Coast. Maybe I'm biased. I am with the Seattle office. But why is it particularly important in Oregon? And what else about Oregon is so compelling for you all?
I mean, one of the first things that when I tell my family, I grew up in Washington State, my family still lives there, and it's weird to call it Washington State, but now that I'm on the East Coast, I do have to make that distinction. But the first thing that my family says to me is, why does Oregon and the Pacific Northwest need offshore wind? Doesn't it already have cheap hydroelectric? And I mean, frankly, growing up in Washington, I used to think that all power came from hydroelectric dams. And I always hear that the hydroelectric system in the Pacific Northwest being described like a battery. But I've never really factored in that there's variability in that resource, just like any renewable resource. It's a balancing act with water levels and varying snowpack levels year to year and what time of year the snow melts. And we don't know what the long-term impacts of climate change may be on the hydroelectric system in the Pacific Northwest. I've recently seen some really great analysis done by Pacific Northwest National Lab that shows that offshore wind can be really complementary to the hydroelectric system. And I think that's an important place to start. Yes, the Pacific Northwest has this great resource that has been transformative to the region, but we need all hands on deck in terms of the amount of renewables in the Pacific Northwest to not only meet the climate goals in the Pacific Northwest and the Pacific more broadly, but also just every single bit is going to help us in the energy transition. From a statute, Oregon needs more renewables based on HB 2021 that requires carbon-free energy generation, and additional onshore wind and solar compared to what's already been installed in the Pacific Northwest may not be the most ideal solutions given that their load profile. And the fact that, in California, one of the things that we hear most often is if you overinstall one type of generation, you end up with a situation where you get kind of this duck curve happening and have to perhaps curtail or have some weird peaking or extreme peaking energy generation to help meet that new challenge to the grid. So offshore wind provides another resource, and having a diversity of resources in a diverse number of locations is really helpful from managing that energy transition to the best we can. There's a question about, one of the things that we see on the East Coast is that offshore wind is really close to load. And the best offshore wind off of the coast of Oregon is not necessarily closest to the load center.
No, it's pretty far away.
It is. But is it as far away? And I actually haven't looked at this on the map, so I don't want to be too glib in this statement, but is it closer to the Oregon load than Wyoming? Because
Probably. I mean, Portland obviously is the biggest load center, but Eugene's pretty huge too. It's about a 4-hour drive from Coos Bay to Portland, but it's only about an hour and a half or 2 hours to Eugene.
Right. And so in looking at what the potential renewable energy solutions are for Oregon, is it better to be building and investing in transmission in the state and building up some coastal resiliency as opposed to bringing wind from Wyoming? And you still have the transmission challenges. You're just bringing energy from the east to the west, which is how the grid has grown. And so everyone who is in power systems planning and in grid planning, their minds are trained to think about energy coming from the east, going to the west. And so in thinking about offshore wind, it breaks that mold a bit. And I think that that becomes a challenge just because it is something that we've never we've never thought about. It's a 180-degree shift in a lot of ways. Like we're talking about generating electrons in a place that we never thought we would be able to generate electrons before. Why would we have built a grid that would even have assumed that 20 years ago? That would have been ridiculous. It's a challenge. I'm not going to beat around that bush. It's going to be a challenge. And there is a perspective shift that needs to happen to allow for that different pathway of power to flow to the load centers. But I wouldn't make it just about offshore wind. It's a renewable energy challenge. The grid wasn't necessarily built for renewable energy, so maybe we need a new grid.
Indeed. Let's have a conversation with Congress about that. And I guess, another part of this too, I suppose, is Oregon's had a lot of challenges over the years around renewable energy and renewable energy generation build outs. One nice thing, and no shade on Wyoming, but one nice thing about offshore wind in Oregon is it's Oregon jobs and it's Oregon ports, right? Which, that's politically attractive, at least around here.
Absolutely. And I would just say that it's really important for Oregonians to see the benefit of a project that would be built off their shore. You can see that through, a couple of different channels, whether that's the long-term family wage jobs in Oregon. You really want, for one, you want your operations and maintenance center to be as close to your offshore wind project as possible. So I would be very surprised if any operations and maintenance jobs would be out of state, just because of where BOEM has so far identified call areas off of the Oregon coast. So those are long-term jobs, 30 years of offshore wind operations and maintenance that needs to be based. And then the construction jobs, obviously, those are not insignificant. Those are
but it's years long.
Years from not just building the offshore wind project itself, but also the infrastructure to support. So there's a long pathway of jobs that come with offshore wind that necessarily will be based in Oregon.
Absolutely. So you've mentioned California a couple of times, and I was down in Coos Bay just a couple of weeks ago, and of course the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust had their big fly-in in Coos Bay just a couple of weeks ago also. If you look at the map, Coos Bay is kind of close to California. Redding's not that far away. And of course, we're seeing with other technologies, solar, wind, that electrons are being sold to CAISO or sold into CAISO. You're from Washington, so there's a bit of a rivalry, between California and Oregon, especially. So as a fifth generation Oregonian, I have to ask, is the power just going to go to California? What's in it for Oregon here?
I mean, I think that the passage of HB 2021 does create the pathway and the need for renewable energy in Oregon. And we see that pathway, and we see that the IOUs are talking about offshore wind. They're talking about it. There's a really good sign that it's not just the developers, it's not just researchers. The utilities are talking about it. We're going to start seeing it in their resource planning. And that is a really good signal that there is space for offshore wind in Oregon, and there's going to be demand, and that that utility interest is really important. Will California be an ultimate customer? It's possible, but I wouldn't say that all of the power is going to just go straight to California. Oregon is going to be the first customer that we look for. And if there's additional capacity to go elsewhere, that's a path that we have to obviously keep the door open to, but Oregon will be the primary customer.
Thanks. So let's have a little bit of fun. You've been in the offshore wind industry for a long time. What's your favorite myth about offshore wind? How do you think it's
I have been in offshore wind for a long time. That's not a myth. It's the only professional career I've known. So that's not a myth. There are favorite myths and there are not so favorite myths. And I'm going to start with a not so favorite myth. One of the things that I think that stakeholders who aren't thinking about offshore wind all the time get challenged with some of the terminology that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, uses. Whether it's a planning area, a call area, a wind energy area, a lease area, like what that all means is very clear to someone who is steeped in offshore wind and is thinking about it all the time. But to someone who is just, trying to pay attention to this on the periphery, that those terms are too close to each other. And so I've been seeing a lot, especially in the Oregon context, where BOEM has just gone recently from this very large planning area. 12,000 square miles worth of Oregon ocean space was originally identified in 2020 as this area of interest for potential planning for offshore wind. Then BOEM narrowed that down. So the first thing is they put this space on a map. They draw lines on a map, and everyone catches their breath and says, "You want to put offshore turbines in all of that area?" And that once you draw lines on a map, you have this initial reaction to it. And the challenge is to try to explain. Once people have that reaction, it's hard to explain that it is part of the process and part of the narrowing. And what we want to do is start with a really big area so that we can get to a deconflicted area. We're talking about going from, in the original set, 12,000 square miles of ocean area down to what BOEM has identified as a target of around 400 square miles. It is a very small portion. And even though BOEM has already gone down from about that 12,000, I think they're close to 1,800 square miles right now in their process in identifying call areas. I recently saw something that was published that said that the idea was to fill up all of the call areas with turbines. And that's still not what we're talking about. We're talking about narrowing, again, that call area down to wind energy areas. Now, I don't know what the best terminology is to make that distinction and to try to help stakeholders understand that there is a process and a pathway to get from these very large areas to what amounts to small in the grand scheme of ocean space. But I would like to dispel rumors that we aren't looking to fill all of the call areas. We are trying to get from call areas and try to help deconflict and find ways to coexist in the ocean from a users and uses perspective to get to that wind energy area or wind energy areas that are small. So I don't have a good way to rename different areas that BOEM identifies, but I think it's important that we dispel the myth that, we're looking to completely fill the ocean with turbines. We are trying to find small areas that are big enough to get a project that is an economic size, but we're not looking to put a wall of turbines along the entire Oregon coast.
I mean, it's sort of like figuring out where you're going to live, right? We should all be so lucky as to pick the city we want to live in. So you pick the city, and then you think you decide you like this neighborhood, right? And then, that's the house for me. Or maybe I'll consider this other one, right? Maybe that's the apartment I want.
That's a really good analogy. I'm going to use that.
Do it. But I think part of this too is, there's a lot of community building in offshore wind and really all renewable energy. And there's some companies that do it really, really well. You set a great example. And I think trying to connect with those stakeholders in those communities on terms that they understand is really key. Right? Take it to their level. They don't need to rise to BOEM's level. They have no interest in doing it anyway, most of the time, because we all have lives to live. I think that's a really good point. Let's round this out just a little bit. We clearly have a lot of things to keep learning about offshore wind, right? You just talked about one specific one, and that's just about basic terminology. What do you think we most need to keep learning about offshore wind other than the jargon?
There are so many things to keep learning about. I mean, and I think it's a fun question for me because I constantly want to keep learning about everything, not just offshore wind, but just generally. That's my personality. The more I can learn about anything, it's exciting to learn more. So I want us to be able to, as developers, to learn from the projects that we have in other areas and take those lessons learned and really show that we are learning from other projects and we want to do things as we learn. Offshore wind is still a young industry. We're, offshore wind from a fixed bottom perspective is about 20 years old. From a floating perspective, we're a lot younger than that. And so there's a lot that we can still learn from projects and get better. And that those learnings, incorporating those into future projects is really it's incredibly important. I understand, and I think we as developers understand that every market is going to have its own unique attributes to it. However, it's being able to take those lessons learned from projects that are on the other coast of the US or in other global locations and being able to tease out what the lessons learned are that are appropriate to bring to the next market. Because there are certain things that aren't, but there's plenty that we can. There are lessons learned from a fixed bottom perspective that we can apply to floating. And what we as developers need to do is provide that connective tissue to be able to meet stakeholders where they are and explain how those lessons learned from other projects are appropriate to bring into their backyard. And so we have to, as the industry, do a good job of learning and explaining how we are going to take, again, what we see from a global perspective and other market perspectives and how to apply that. And hopefully we can meet stakeholders where they are and in a place where we are listening to each other and we are open to learning together.
Fabulous. I think that's a really great message, for life, but also for offshore wind. Thank you, Alana, for spending the time with me today. This has been terrific. We're excited to see where you and offshore wind and deep blue Pacific wind go in the next few years. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. This was great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, subscribe by searching Hub Talks, that's HUB Talks, in your favorite podcast app. We hope you will tune in next time to learn more about the outlook of the burgeoning sustainable economy.